Well, I'll start. So I thought I'd start with this little topic. You hear it said by both major political parties, the Liberals and the Conservatives, the two least important parties, that the New Brunswick has already met its Paris target agreements, that we've already reduced our emissions by 30% compared to 2005 levels. And the basis for that claim is that our emissions in 2005 were 20.1 megatons, and in 2015 they were 14.3 megatons. And that is nearly a 30% reduction. And so it is said, hey, we don't need to do anything else. Let's forget this carbon pricing. We're okay. We're in the clear. But there's 4 points to be made here. The first is that if we do nothing, New Brunswick's greenhouse gas, let's call them GHGs, our emissions are going to go up. Indeed, they already went up by 1 million tonnes in 2016 because apparently MB Power is cranking up Beldoon and selling electricity to the United States. Second, New Brunswick has signed regional agreements with New England and the other Atlantic provinces, and we have pledged to reduce our emissions to 10.7 megatons by 2030, so we need to have another 4 megaton reduction. Third, the recent IPCC report calls for a 45% reduction by 2030, so that means we've actually got to get them down to 8 megatons by 2030. Oh, and by the way, we've got to get completely off carbon by 2050. So basically, let's move on. Let's forget this claim that we've already done everything that we need to, and let's move on and talk about the best way to do something. So these were my assigned questions. Why economists believe so strongly that carbon pricing will reduce emissions? What's the difference between taxes and cap and trade? Is carbon pricing a necessary part of an effective climate change solution? And what would a fair implementation look like to the average family? So that's my kind of plan. I'm going to try and address these questions. So first one, why do economists believe so strongly in carbon pricing? And basically the idea is that anything that is free but scarce will be overused. So given the fact that we've got a carbon budget, that makes carbon emissions scarce, a scarce resource, and they should be rationed. So economists believe in the efficiency of markets and in the effectiveness of prices to ration the use of scarce resources. So that is it. We believe in the efficiency of markets. And even as a sort of anti-economist myself, I mean, it's rather interesting when I hear other people criticize economists. It's like someone's criticizing my mother. Hang on, I'm allowed to criticize my mother, you're not. Get all defensive about it. But yeah, so, you know, markets are a very effective way to ration scarce resources. Okay, so that's why. Do they really work? And the answer to that is yes, but. And what do I mean by that? Carbon prices or carbon taxes work. Yes, they do, but tiny taxes lead to tiny changes. And the plan, and here I'm doing what I'm not supposed to do, but it's impossible to talk about carbon pricing in general. We have to talk about it specifically. So specifically, the carbon pricing that we're going to have introduced is tiny. This $10 a tonne next year, $50 a tonne 2022. These are tiny taxes. What would an appropriate carbon price be? Well, it would be around $178 a tonne next year, rising to about $345 a tonne by 2035. Source for that. And the IPCC report doesn't give us much guidelines because it simply says the carbon tax should range from $135 a tonne to $5,500 a tonne by 2030. I mean, that's just so wide. But it does give you an indication that the taxes that are coming in are just tiny. They're way too small. What's the difference between carbon taxes and cap and trade? So when you have a carbon tax or a carbon price, the government determines the cost of emissions. And then, given the responsiveness of emissions to the cost, The market determines the amount of emissions. Whereas, with tradable emission permits, which is what cap and trade is, they give or auction emission permits to industry, and then they're allowed to be traded. So tradable emission permits is cap and trade. Under this system, the government determines the amount of emissions, and then, given the responsiveness of emissions to cost, the market determines the cost of a permit. So what's the difference? The difference is that we actually are a little bit uncertain about the responsiveness of emissions to cost. So that's actually this middle bit. If we knew for certain the responsiveness of emissions to costs, these two schemes would be exactly equivalent. Okay, so what are the advantages of tradable emission permits? Well, there's a direct link between permits issued and emission reduction, which clearly we don't have with carbon taxes because we're a little bit uncertain about the responsiveness of emissions to the cost of emitting. Second, anyone can buy up permits and not use them. So, you could have some huge Greenpeace buy up some emissions, permits rather, you issued too many, we don't like that, we're going to buy them up and burn them. Oh, not burn them, no, bury them. There's advantages of a carbon tax. One, well, it definitely raises revenue. It's not clear how we're distributing these permits. Maybe we're auctioning them, maybe we're giving them away. So a carbon tax definitely raises revenue, and this can either be given back in some way, or it can be used to fight climate change. But the complication with either of these is trade. Trade, massive complication, which I'm going to get back to in a minute. So what will the money be used for? So we could use it to subsidize stuff, good stuff, to help fight climate change. But under the federal plan, 80% of the revenue is given back to households, which of course, as Louise explained, this is to blunt the opposition to it. It's to make it clear that you cannot criticize this on the basis of it being a tax grab. Because it's not. You're going to get the money back. So, in fact, this is the same information but organized slightly differently. So the blue is the average cost per household and the green is the rebate. So we go to the second column and you see that actually the average household is getting a bigger rebate than it's projected to cost. So, although, as Robert Jones pointed out, Saskatchewan's getting bigger rebates than New Brunswick, as if we're sort of penalised in this respect. So why are the rebates greater than the cost? And the answer to that is that industries also pay but don't get a rebate. The other thing about this is that higher income households have a bigger carbon footprint, but they get the same rebate because the rebate is determined by the number of people in the household. So actually that makes the rebates progressive. The lower income household is actually better off than the higher income household on this. This is an attempt to explain the difference in cost per household and rebates per household, how that differs by province. And part of the explanation is that Saskatchewan has way more emissions per capita than New Brunswick. New Brunswick is the second highest, but actually we've got the lowest cost and the lowest rebates. So actually emissions per capita is only a partial explanation. To really understand that, you need to have a long talk with Louise afterwards. So the question, how would it affect you and your family? So obviously we're going to pay more for fossil fuel related goods, but we're going to get the money back as a tax rebate. And the question that's often asked, that Louise very well addressed, is, why would this cause us to reduce our fossil fuel use? And the answer is because you get the same rebate even if your carbon footprint goes to 0. So it pays you not to have a carbon footprint. So the idea is we're going to substitute away from more expensive things. We are more likely, because they're more expensive, we're more likely to choose a more fuel-efficient vehicle, drive less, insulate our homes, invest in a heat pump, and on and on. We're more likely to do that because the cost of not doing it goes up. Is carbon pricing a necessary part of any climate change solution? Well, the answer to this is, of course, no, not really. It's not necessary. We could use standards or regulation. But economists argue that standards are inefficient. Now, why are they inefficient? They're inefficient because they impose, of course, any system can be gamed, but this is the way economists think about it. Standards are imposed equally on all firms. But some firms can reduce emissions more easily than others. And that's obvious. Firms that are using newer technology can reduce their emissions more easily than ones using older technology. And an efficient system of carbon abatement, of emission abatement, should utilize that fact. If you don't utilize that fact, you're not having an efficient solution. You've got to have a system that uses all available information. You know some firms can reduce emissions more easily than others. Use that fact. So, those that can more easily reduce their emissions should do so and avoid the carbon tax. Those that can't should continue emitting because for them it's cheaper to pay the tax. But the tax remains as an incentive for those firms to reduce emissions, to improve their technology. So to make emission reductions more politically palatable, we should reduce them in the most cost-effective way. And this is the reason why it may be said, yeah, oh, there's all this hostility to carbon pricing, and maybe we prefer to have environmental standards. Ah, yes, we would. Aha, we'd all prefer environmental standards, but that's before you know how much it's going to cost you. When you have the environmental standards and you realise that this is going to mean your electricity bills are going to go up 30% in 8 years, then you won't be so much in favour of environmental standards, my friends. Environmental standards in abstract are much more preferable, but not in the concrete. They're a more inefficient system, they will cost you more. And you see the opposition to what we already have for carbon pricing. So you want to do this in the most cost-effective way. So what about the big polluters? Will they pay more? We need that for any efficient system? Not necessarily, and this comes back to the trade complication. We don't want to make our industries uncompetitive. That's why they may not be paying their fair share. We don't want to make them uncompetitive internationally. This issue wouldn't arise if all countries had got on board with carbon pricing. Then we could just do it. Simple. But they're not. So we have to worry about this. We can't afford to lose jobs. Or have them just move to a low carbon pricing jurisdiction. I mean, the point is, what would the benefit be to the world if we shut down Baldoon but then started importing electricity from the US, from coal-powered generating stations in the US? We have the same GHG emissions, it's just that we're not doing it by our production, we're doing it through our consumption. So, what's the best way to deal with this trade complication? I mean, if you just sit back and scratch your head and think about it, the obvious best way to deal with it is you should rebate the carbon tax for all goods that are exported to jurisdictions with no carbon tax. And you should impose a carbon tax on all goods imported that are made in jurisdictions with no carbon tax or a carbon tax lower than ours. I mean, that's the obvious way to do it. But we can't, and this would work if we had a pan-Canadian system. But we don't. We have a flimsy patchwork. This is the current patchwork. We've got a pretty good carbon tax in BC, currently a $20 carbon tax in Alberta. In the pre-Doug Ford, we had cap and trade in Ontario, which the effective price for carbon was $18. Quebec has cap and trade, the effective price for carbon is $16. It's a patchwork. So instead, because we can't have this nice global pan-Canadian system, and some people say that, by the way, the federal government should have imposed a pan-Canadian system, that the federal government has the power to do so, and it should have done it. It's scared though, isn't it? It's just scared because of the history of the National Energy Program in the 1980s. It doesn't want to lose its voting base. It's so scared to do it, it got to this flimsy patchwork. So instead of the pan-Canadian system, what we're doing is the special arrangement for emission-intensive trade-exposed industries. And this is kind of a bit, maybe too much detail. So for such industries, there's an output-based pricing system, and emitters get rebates on emissions below a threshold. What is the threshold? This is usually the average or best in class for the industry, which means that the best in class pay nothing for that intensity. You know, they have so many emissions per kilowatt, and then no matter how much emissions are, you'll get a free ride for those emissions per kilowatt. The worst gets a carbon tax break that helps maintain competitiveness. And economists reckon this is a good system. I mean, I've glanced at the papers that prove that this is a very efficient system, and I believe them. There's the burning question of coal. So the federal plan comes with one huge flaw, of course, in its treatment of coal. It applies the benchmark for credits differently to different fuel sources. Gas is treated in a stricter way than coal, despite being a clean fuel, and that means that basically coal is going to be taxed the equivalent of $1 a tonne. And the average Canadian will pay 20 bucks a tonne, and that makes coal plants cheap to run, cheaper than gas, and this is going to do some very nasty things, especially in Alberta, where they were doing some very good things. At least until 2030, when the environmental regulations come in, and it's no longer going to be, you're no longer going to be allowed to have coal-powered electric generating stations. What other solutions? Well, how's about this radical idea? How's about we eliminate all fossil fuel subsidies? That would be good, wouldn't it? So there was a lovely article in the Huffington Post where the coalition of 4 environmental groups have summed up the tax exemptions, the investment credits, the royalty breaks, and they compared these against the emissions data, and they concluded that the carbon subsidy averages out about $19 a tonne of carbon dioxide at the minute. So it'd be nice to get rid of that. What will it mean to the average Canadian family? What would a fair, I think that's supposed to say, what would a fair system look like to the average Canadian family? And here, I'm putting this as a question. I would say a fair system to the average Canadian family is one where they don't have to change where you live, the trucks, the skidoos, the ATVs, the powerboats they drive. One where there's no pain at all, no increase in the price for anything. That would seem to be a fair system. And I'm putting that as a question because I don't really know. It could be sometimes I think that is the case. What's my preferred solution? Well, I've got a preferred solution for New Brunswick and a preferred solution for Canada, because the big difference between New Brunswick and Canada is that New Brunswick is facing a debt crunch. It can't borrow, whereas the federal government can. All federal governments that are in control of their own currency can borrow in their own currency almost to an unlimited extent. So we could have a little discussion about that if you want to. But my preferred solution for New Brunswick is that the government goes to the feds and say, we're sorry, we made a mistake. We're not going to take you to court. We're going to accept we're going to have our own plan. Actually, we've now got a Made in New Brunswick plan. It's not yours, it's ours. It's going to be exactly the same as yours. except we're going to tax coal $2 a tonne. So our plan is the same as yours, but better. And that means that now New Brunswick gets control of the money. We can do what we like with it. And I would propose that what we do with the money is we give rebates back to low-income people. We have a cut-off. We can talk about where the cut-off is. Is it the average income? Is it the median income? Where is that cut-off? 60,000, 70,000? I don't care. You decide where the cut-off is. But that will give us a nice pot of money after we've done all the rebates to the low-income households. And with that pot of money, I think we should stormproof MV Power. We should get rid of Beldoon. We should have smart meters in every household. We should start doing something about the effects of climate change in this province. What's my solution for Canada as a whole? Well, treat it like a war, right? A war. That's what there is, a war. Now what we should do, how did we finance the Second World War? By borrowing the money. Oh, that's borrowing from the future. You bet it is, because unless we get this right, there will be no future. You borrow the money and you use that money massively to fund major infrastructure switch. There's nothing to stop the federal government from borrowing massively. If it borrows in its own currency, which it is in control of, because it issues it. Any downside effect? Well, it would have been really nice if we'd done this in 2008, 2009, when the world economy was in a downturn and there was all this slack in the economy. And now we're kind of close to full employment, so the only possible downside is we might generate a bit of inflation. Big deal. Inflation is actually very good for business. Very good for business. Very good for the economy. The economy nearly always is booming. There'll be more jobs. Actually, there'll be more wealth. This is the way to go, and I don't know why it's not being done. Thank you very much.